Hi, it's Arjun. I wanted to follow up on the special edition episode of Close of Business Tuesday video podcast that my colleagues and I recorded with Veriton this past week, where we interviewed Mark Lashier, the CEO of Phillips 66. P66, as I think everyone knows, is in the midst of a proxy battle with Elliott Advisors. And I'll refer everyone to that published episode from earlier this week. The company, as well as Elliott, has a bunch of materials on their respective websites. All of that you can find there. As you know, at Superspiked, it's kind of our self-imposed policy to not talk about active current situations of current companies. And that is not the intention of this week's Superspiked video podcast. What I do want to do, though, is discuss a few of the topics and how we think about corporate strategy, including what it means to be a diversified energy player versus a pure play, when it does make sense to restructure and split apart and when it doesn't, and then when does external activism make sense, and or how can you be your best internal activist? And we're in one of those macro environments where a lot is changing in terms of the outlook for China, the increase in maturity of shale oil, faster expected growth in power generation, and which energy sources are going to help meet that growth. Geopolitics remain front and center. We expect oil demand to continue to grow in the years ahead, but it's going to be choppier than certainly we saw in the prior 20. Natural gas, LNG, and natural gas liquids all look like they're going to grow faster than oil. But what is the right business model for companies to participate, and which companies should participate? Will upstream companies need to start looking overseas again? And if so, who should do that? How are they going to do that? There are a lot of moving parts. And as companies potentially make meaningful strategic actions, there can be a disconnect between what some investors will prefer they do in the short run versus an evaluation of the risk-reward opportunity for companies over the long run, the long-term bets, if you will, that companies will make. And as companies take those steps, some are going to be second-guessed. And the specter of rising shareholder activism, I think, is going to be there. And to be clear here, different analysts can have different views on any of these points. We're not saying we're right and everyone's wrong. We are trying to share our perspectives on how we think companies should think about this environment. There is no one-size-fits-all answer to any of this stuff. And I know it can be frustrating or perhaps annoying that sometimes luck and cycle timing can matter a lot. But so does good governance and high-quality management teams. No one bats 1,000. Mistakes will be made. But we all know that structural underperformance isn't acceptable either. And you can see a different background today, by the way. I'm actually in Houston at the Veriton offices and in my office here in Veriton, and excited to record it here from this location. So let me start with this question of being diversified versus being a pure play. And I think the first comment would simply be is people throw around this term conglomerate. To me, the classic definition of a conglomerate is you're in a bunch of unrelated, truly unrelated businesses. You've got a turbine business, an aviation business, a media enterprise. I'm using, obviously, GE as the example there. That is a conglomerate. In energy, you may not be a single basin pure play. You might have a bunch of different business lines. It could be upstream, downstream. It could be midstream, whatever the case may be. I would differentiate being a diversified energy company with being a conglomerate. And I do not believe the conglomerate term should be thrown around for really any of the companies that I'm familiar with in the energy sector. I will say size matters. As you become larger, the idea that you can remain a pure play, whether it's single basin, single asset, single type of business, that to me, that makes sense as a smaller size. It does not make sense as you go large. And I'm just going to pull up one more slide here is, to me, there are a number of different reasons companies exist. The good reasons are you're trying to be a going concern. I'll define that. You have a differential opportunity to generate differential growth and returns, or you're an M&A target. These are the good outcomes. And in that going concern bucket, which to me means you're capable of generating really low to mid-teens returns on capital over the full cycle. At a normal trough, you should be at least cost of capital. At a deep trough, you should never lose money. And in the really good times, 20% plus returns on capital. As you become larger, it's a mature business. Growth rates will be slower. It's going to be more about dividend policies and ensuring you have a suite of assets and opportunities that can ensure you are a quote going concern. That means you do as well or do better than the S&P 500 over long periods of time and outperform, I'm going to say, a broad proxy of energy companies. I tend to use the XLE, the energy stocks in the S&P 500, the ETF that tracks that is sort of my proxy for the sector. At the smaller size, usually it's exposure to a differential asset or opportunity in the upstream. It could be a new basin that's emerging. Years ago, Tosco and Valero back in the day, they were kind of acquire and exploit refiners in the 1990s when the majors were divesting of downstream businesses, whatever the case may be. Differential growth returns can drive better stock performance, or you might be single asset, single basin, as the case may be, and you're setting yourself up to get bought. These are all the good outcomes. And again, for the going concern portion of it, again, there's some metrics I put with that in terms of returns, in terms of what you do at the trough, how you think about dividend policies. If that is the goal, and I think it should be explicit, if your goal is to be a going concern company, then you have to earn the right to be a going concern. But it also means you're going to have a diversified business mix in some manner. It doesn't mean you have to be integrated. It also doesn't mean you should only be a super major to qualify in that bucket. You're typically going to add some midstream, downstream opportunities, different basins, whatever the case may be. I want to make sure I pull up here what the bad outcomes are. I think the worst thing you can be as an energy company, well, maybe it's the second worst thing, is a cycle rider, where you're just going up and down with commodity prices. You are earning kind of cost of capital returns over the cycle. You're probably losing a bunch of money at the troughs. We're trying to avoid that. I think every company should be trying to avoid that. Now, it's a commodity business. By definition, there are going to be a whole bunch of companies that fit into that bucket. The goal is to not be a cycle rider. But of course, being worse than a cycle rider is actually the living dead, where companies simply exist and persist, and there isn't any rhyme or reason for why you're still around. We are trying to avoid these outcomes. So when we talk about there's too much focus on pure plays, and that there is a case to be made for diversified business models, it does come with the prerequisite that the returns have to be good. As you become larger, the dividend policy, stock buyback policies have to be there and so forth. And I think there is a need to be honest about those assessments. But the idea that everyone should just get into some singular bucket and be a quote pure play, there's no evidence that that is actually true or that that's the way you'd want to go. You run the risk when you're a pure play of becoming a cycle rider. And they have their moments in time. If we were about to go through a major super cycle in oil, which some people believe, well, in that case, then having perhaps a pure play oil producer could make sense. It's not our view. Our view is super vol at the moment. But even if you were to be that, the good outcome would still mean you're setting yourselves up to sell yourself. I think to be a going concern company, which should be the goal for a whole bunch of companies, it's about having a broad suite of assets that can generate differential returns. The related point on sort of pure play versus diversified, this idea that you should set yourself up so you look just like some peers that, energy dedicated analysts can evaluate more easily, absolute nonsense. You run the risk of being a cycle rider. Why would you want to do that? Or worse, you run the risk of turning into the living dead. Not okay. Companies should look to be differentiated. I think of the leading companies in the stock market. There's no one like that. There's no one like Apple. When they were struggling 25 years ago or whenever it was, and they had hardware and software, it did not make sense. It would have been the wrong call to have said we should only be software or only hardware if you're Apple. Instead, they created a hugely unique differential platform that made them a multi-trillion-dollar company. Google, one of a kind. Meta, one of a kind. You could say, Arjun, you're just giving a bunch of tech examples, so they can do that. It is true in energy. When you look at some of the leading companies, I'm not going to try and get myself into trouble by naming individual names, but they often had a very differentiated strategy. I will go to the past. When Tom O'Malley first did the acquire and exploit for refining, people like acquire and exploit and refining. Yeah, I know Ray Plank's Apache used to do that back in the day, but why would you want to buy refineries? Everyone knows it's a low return, bad business, but they bought them for pennies on the dollar, right? The first pioneers to go into the shale plays, very unique at the time. And so To me, it is about being differentiated. You don't want to look like everyone else. What's the point? You run the risk of we don't need more of the same in this sector. It is always about sustainable profitability, better than your cost of capital. The question is always, how do you get there? So I want to spend a few moments now on earning the right to continue. And what I mean is the right to continue as a publicly traded company that I'm going to say is a going concern. And I mentioned this in the previous part. It is about superior profitability, but it's also about differential exposures that are unique to your peer group of companies. This business is always changing. The risk when you're a pure play is that the world moves on from that asset. And I go back to my career, and it was the Cotton Valley Reef trend. It was 3D seismic bright spots. It was originally the Pinedale anticline and the Fayetteville shale. Then it was the Barnett shale, and then it was the Marcellus shale. And if you were in those previous shale plays, you better have switched from the Pinedale and Fayetteville to the Barnett, and then you better have switched to the Marcellus, but not just any part of the Marcellus, the best parts of the Marcellus, as an example in the gas business. In the oil business, we thought you wanted to be overseas and international and all these kind of things, and it turned out the Permian Basin and U.S. shale was the place to be. The business is always changing. And when you're a pure play, what is your ability to jump from the new and the next hot area? Now, you might say there is absolutely a role for companies to create pure plays, but then from a management and a board perspective, are you thinking, well, we need to make sure we sell ourselves in an M&A situation, instead of trying to jump to the new area? Otherwise, what you're trying to do is diversify your business mix and go to where the next low-cost area is going to be. This business is always changing. The idea that you'd want to be stuck in a pure play paradigm, you run the risk of being a cycle rider, you run the risk of being the living dead. The cycles are long in this business, and when you have multi-year investment programs, it can really mask some of the changes to the underlying trends, and it can create an inertia. And we need to stick with what we're doing right now. As an example, we all know energy industry overinvested in the 2007 to 2014 time period, and returns on capital peaked, as I've noted, in 06, 07, and it was a 12 or I guess a 14-year downturn to the trough in 2020. I do think that's in the past now. If anything, is there enough risk taking right now? And not everyone should be taking risks. But there is a sense in our view that shale is maturing. I already mentioned a bunch of macro variables around gas, LNG, natural gas liquids, the role of China, geopolitics, all of this stuff is changing. What are the next areas companies should be looking at? What are the differential risk opportunities? For sure, there are companies that should do nothing and should liquidate or pay out dividends. But people need to be careful. You don't get stuck in the past. And I think when the business is always changing, but when it changes slowly, you really run the risk of missing what the next opportunity is going to be. Each company has its own unique journey. And I apologize. I think to investors, that's going to sound like consultant talk. And I apologize to all the investors out there for that language. But what makes sense for one company to do may not make sense for another. All companies got to where they are today through a series of actions. And so, for example, let's just say the Permian Basin has been the best place to be in over the last decade. That did not mean that everyone who was in the Permian had to have gotten in. The assets and the areas and the expertise you developed, how you apply that has to be consistent with who you are. It wouldn't have made sense for refining companies, by and large, to have gotten into Permian upstream, even if they were early, as an example. It doesn't necessarily make sense for someone who is an expert in the LNG business to suddenly get into the refining business or the power generation business. And so our point would simply be, you have to start with where's the company today? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And how do they take advantage of their unique opportunities and not just follow the crowd? It's the kind of point we've been trying to make, this idea that everyone should be a pure play that looks like a whole bunch of other companies. Absolute nonsense. How do you look at where is my company today? What are all the assets and skill sets and people that we have? How do we improve upon that? And how do we leverage that into where the puck is going? What are going to be the future low-cost areas of opportunity? Business is big and it's wide. And there's a whole bunch of different areas and moving parts. the idea that everyone needs to restructure to, over the last decade, as an example, I did not think every company needed to be a pure play shale producer. And I believe I've been right about that. Even though there was pressure for some companies, hey, we've seen some companies get rid of offshore or international and become shale pure plays. Where are they now? Where are some of those companies now? Some have done really well. Some have had to sell. There are areas that some companies are in that other companies should not get into. Each company's journey is unique. I can't tell if I'm expressing this very well or not. But the idea, our point would be that everyone needs to look like some smooth, some perfect analyst peer group of companies. Absolute nonsense. The goal is to be differentiated, to be unique. Just on the final slide, I just want to talk about kind of activism, if you will, and sort of internal versus external. I think the first point would be that understanding the quality of a board and the dynamics can be really hard to judge from the outside. It is not about having some all-star cast of characters. It is very hard to know the degree to which an existing management team wants to engage in intense discussion and debate. And by the way, this idea that board members are always right, we know that that is not true either. I'm going to keep it nameless, but I think there's some front and center current examples where it was frankly the board that pushed companies to do certain actions that I think are now going to be unwound. So anyway, it's a tough thing to assess from the outside, this idea of sort of board quality and dynamics, but it actually is critical. And as a reminder, public company board members do not manage the company. As a board, your job is to evaluate the CEO, who might also be the chairperson of the board, and to figure out, do you have confidence in that person to hire the right president, COO, CFO, so forth, and then all the people within the organization? Do you have confidence in the CEO who's running the company? And then do they have confidence in their people? And as a board member, do you have confidence in their board people? You are not running the company. You're not deciding exactly what the production growth should be or what the various metrics. You are evaluating it. You're providing feedback. You're providing oversight. Do they have a good system of controls? Have they really thought through the pros and cons of this? Are they considering different perspectives as they evaluate what's next? But it is the management team. And I do notice in these activism situations, this point to me feels like it's getting confused at times. The board member is not there to stand over the shoulders of some divisional manager and say, hey, how's it going, person? You are there to provide your guidance, your judgment, to provide a check. But at the end of the day, it is the CEO that runs the company. Do you have confidence in that person? There's also this idea that somehow the chairman and CEO should be separated, and that's, quote, better governance. Absolute nonsense. That is not true in my experience as a 33-year analyst covering the company. There certainly are situations where it might make sense. If you had an unexpected change where the existing CEO had to leave, maybe it was a health reason or some other reason, and the successor, was at a point in time where maybe you weren't sure if they were fully baked for the position at the moment. In some of those situations, perhaps an independent chairman can make sense. So I'm not saying it never makes sense. But by and large, the idea that the CEO is overseeing the management team and also interacting with the board and setting the agendas, to me, it makes a lot of sense most of the time. I'm going to use as my example the difference in governance between European companies and American companies. I always make the plea in Super Spiked, I never want America to turn into Europe as a country. I love Europe in the terms of it's a great place to vacation. One of my children goes to school over in Europe. A lot of friends and family there. Love Europe to visit. I love being an American and living in America and all that comes with that country. And that goes for corporate governance as well. Look at the examples. We don't need to name them. You know who they are. Where you've got separate chairmen and CEOs. How's that working out? Are we sure that some of these companies that are under pressure today, it wasn't actually the board and the chairman that have led these strategies astray or put a lot of pressure? Hey, we're in a major energy transition. Let's do a whole bunch of. Are we sure it was actually the management teams that deserve all the blame for that? In my opinion, the idea that it's automatically good governance to have these. Show me the data. I do not see any actual data that says you want these things always separate. Again, There may be circumstances where for a time it does make sense. I'm going to say usually or often, and especially in the American style of corporations, which I prefer, I think you're usually better off together. At the end of the day, you're trying to have active, engaged, constructive discussions. This isn't about hostility and fighting with the management teams. If you don't have confidence in the management team, then you should change the CEO. You are trying to challenge them. You're trying to give them your perspectives. But at the end of the day, they're the ones running the company. And you have to have confidence in that person or group of people, the full executive leadership team. Do you have the best people there? And how are they running the company? So I'll end this video on a personal note. And I just wanted to reflect on some of my favorite board discussion. I'm going to do the early part of my career. This is all when I was 40 years old or younger. And I want to go through three examples. One was when I was at JP Morgan Investment Management, and then two that were related to Sunoco. I'll do the JPMIM one first. I'd been at JP Morgan maybe 6 or 9 months, and there was a need to give an energy-oriented presentation to one of the major investors. And JP Morgan had defined benefit pension plans at the time. So it was someone's pension plan. And the board I was presenting to, it included Paul Volcker, the legendary Fed chairman who killed inflation in the early 1980s. I want to say George Putnam was on that board. Those are the names I remember. And at JPMIM, they were just out of senior people to go deliver this presentation on energy to the board. And so they asked me to do it. And I remember the senior account representative, his first name was George. I'm going to forget his last name, but this is early 1990s, mid 1990s, excuse me. It's probably 96, something like that. I am 25, 26 years old. There's no touchy-feely nonsense back in those days. And I know this guy was nervous as heck. It was a very, sorry for the term, blue-blooded culture. The person either lived in New Canaan or Darien, Connecticut. And here is this young guy, kind of newer to JP Morgan, having to deliver an energy presentation to the board. I remember what I talked about. We were trying to talk about kind of how we have unique perspectives on investing. And the pitch I made, or the call I made, was that Anadarko's discoveries in Algeria were being unfairly penalized by the market for excessive geopolitical risk because of the civil war that was going on, when in fact it was in the desert. The production sharing contract terms I thought were good. The oil discoveries were great. And that this was going to be a much better risk return opportunity than those that were investing in the North Sea. Where I said the North Sea is actually much riskier than Algeria. They're always changing the tax rates and the excess profit taxes. And how do you have confidence in UK governance of their oil fields? This is well below before net zero, so it's always been a problem. And I remember getting a huge. They enjoyed the presentation, and we came back to JP Morgan's offices, and this very proper senior person at JP Morgan, he gave me a hug. I always remember getting that hug. He's like, thank you for doing this. It was an awesome presentation. So that really stood out to me. The other two I want to go through is Sunoco. The first one was this is pre Lynn Elsentan's. I'm going to get to her tenure. This was Sunoco was a former integrated oil. I think they spun off the upstream as Oryx Energy, and it became kind of this mishmash of downstream and other things. But this is probably early 2000s. I was at Goldman Sachs at the time, and it was a board that I thought was very sleepy, and the company was sleepy. And I remember one of the board members actually fell asleep during my presentation. Now, maybe it wasn't that great of a presentation. I've always sort of been able to kind of get people going with the talks and so forth, but I did not in this case. And I remember it really stuck with me. I was like, sleepy company. I got a board member actually sleeping. And it really kind of skewed my view of Sunoco. So when Lynn Elsenhans took over, and I knew of Lynn from Royal Dutch Shell, where she had a senior position running their natural gas business, very successful career there. Shell was dominant in natural gas in the LNG business, and Lynn had a huge part of that, as did her predecessors and her successors. It's a real, kind of franchise business for what is now Shell. And she went over to Sunoco. And I remember thinking, oh, that's terrific. They've actually got some fresh blood here. But I always stuck with me that prior board meeting and sort of my legacy of covering Sunoco, which is sleepy company. They're going to be cycle riders or the living dead or what have you. And we had a sell rating on Sunoco. We had a sell rating because we did not have confidence in Northeast refining at the time. And we thought, I kind of like some of the things Lynn is talking about, but the Northeast refining is going to weigh down the good things she's doing, and she'll never be able to change the company enough, was my impression. I didn't have sufficient confidence in her ability to get things done because I thought that sleepy board, and it probably had changed and I didn't appreciate it, we're going to stop and they're going to kind of try and keep the legacy of Sunoco going. And I'll just say to fast forward to 2 points. First of all, I got the call totally wrong. Lynn transformed Sunoco. She ended up selling the refining businesses. But what she had me do, as a sell-rated analyst, I came in and presented to the board. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really odd. I mean, I know we sort of get along a little bit, and I certainly respect her. But, when an analyst has a sell rating on a stock, usually you're not being invited to do board presentations. And I never put two and two together. It never dawned on me that part of why she had me there was she was trying to shake up that board and say, we need to change. And we can't continue with this legacy Northeast refining business. It's killing us. And I was probably not quite a prominent, well, let's see, she was CEO from 08 to 12. So I guess I probably had made my big calls at Goldman. So I was a better known analyst by this point in time. But she had me come in and present our sell-rated thesis to the board, which was all centered around Northeast refining. And I never put two and two together. Lo and behold, they ended up selling the assets. The stock was a total home run. I missed it. It's one of the worst, missed calls of I got to do another dumb calls as a street analyst series. But, these are just some of the board it's always been fun interacting and meeting with the boards of these companies. It's what I love about the current Veriton role, where we get to do a lot of this kind of stuff. And anyway, just some thoughts from early in my career. Thank you.